It started with a simple question from a 6-year-old girl. "Daddy, she's in trouble." What followed would shake an entire industry, expose a billion-dollar conspiracy, and transform a quiet single-father carpenter into the center of a corporate revolution. One moment of instinct in a small-town coffeehouse set off a ripple effect that reached boardrooms across the nation, criminal networks, and the hearts of thousands of working families. And it all began with courage and 3 unexpected Ferraris arriving the next morning. Drevin Thorsell never imagined that teaching his daughter, callous about helping others, would thrust him into a deadly game of corporate espionage. When a mysterious woman stumbled into Millbrook Cafe that rainy Tuesday evening, neither Drevin nor his 6-year-old daughter knew they were looking at Tavira Morwen, CEO of Morwen Industries, one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. But someone else knew exactly who she was, and they wanted her gone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The gentle hum of rain against the windows of Millbrook Cafe created a soothing backdrop that Tuesday evening, masking the tension that would soon shatter the peaceful atmosphere. Drevin Thorsell sat in his usual corner booth, fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug of black coffee that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago. His calloused hands, permanently stained with wood stain and honest work, told the story of a man who built things with his own strength. Across from him, 6-year-old Kayla swung her legs beneath the red vinyl seat, her small fingers carefully arranging sugar packets into what she called tiny white soldiers. Her auburn curls caught the soft amber light from the vintage pendant lamps overhead, and her bright green eyes sparkled with the kind of wonder that only comes from seeing magic in the ordinary world. These Tuesday evening visits to Millbrook Cafe had become their sacred ritual over the past year. After Drevin finished his carpentry work for the day and picked Kayla up from her after-school program, they would drive the winding road from Thornwick Valley into the small downtown district of Millbrook. The cafe, nestled between Harper's Used Books and a small flower shop called Petals and Pine, felt like stepping into a different era. The walls were lined with exposed brick, adorned with local artwork and vintage photographs of the town's founding families. Mismatched wooden tables and chairs gave the space a homey, eclectic feel that Drevin appreciated. This wasn't some corporate chain with sterile efficiency and rushed service. This was Millbrook Cafe, where Betty knew everyone's order, where the pie was homemade daily, and where a single father could sit with his daughter without feeling judged or rushed. Drevin watched Khalees build her sugar packet fortress, marveling at how she could find joy in the simplest things. Her imagination was boundless, inherited perhaps from her mother Sarah, who had passed when Kayla was just 3. Sarah had been the dreamer in their relationship, the one who saw potential where others saw problems, who believed in happy endings even when life seemed determined to prove otherwise. Now Drevin carried that responsibility alone, determined to nurture that same sense of wonder and optimism in their daughter while keeping her safely grounded in reality. It was a delicate balance, protecting her innocence while preparing her for a world that wasn't always kind to dreamers. The cafe's evening crowd was typical for a Tuesday. A few university students hunched over laptops in the corner, their textbooks spread across small tables like battle plans. An elderly couple sharing a slice of apple pie, their conversation flowing with the comfortable rhythm of decades together. A businessman in a wrinkled suit nursing his 3rd cup of coffee while scrolling through emails on his phone, clearly delayed by the weather. Betty Martinez, the cafe's owner and primary waitress, moved between tables with the practiced grace of someone who had been serving coffee and comfort for over 2 decades. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her apron bore the cheerful stains of a day spent crafting lattes and plating sandwiches. She had known Drevin since he was Callus's age, back when his grandfather used to bring him here for hot chocolate and stories about the old days. "How's the construction on the Pemberton house coming along?" Betty asked as she refilled Drevin's coffee cup. the steam rising like small prayers in the warm air. "Should be finished by next week," Drevin replied, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Mrs. Pemberton wants custom built-ins for her library. Real cherry wood, hand-carved details. It's the kind of project you don't see much anymore. Betty nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said you had the hands for fine work." Drevin's grandfather had been the one to teach him carpentry, passing down not just the technical skills, but the philosophy behind the craft. "Measure twice, cut once," the old man used to say. "And remember, son, you're not just building furniture or fixing houses. You're building trust, creating something that will outlast you, something that families will pass down through generations." That philosophy had guided Drevin through his toughest times, including the dark months after Sarah's death, when he wondered if he could raise Kayleigh alone. The steady rhythm of saw and hammer, the satisfaction of transforming raw lumber into something beautiful and functional, had been his anchor during those storms. "Daddy, look," Callis said, interrupting his thoughts. She had arranged her sugar packet soldiers into a perfect circle. "They're protecting the castle." She pointed to the sugar dispenser in the center. "That's a mighty fine castle guard," Drevin said, leaning forward to examine her work with the seriousness it deserved. "What are they protecting the castle from?" Callis considered this carefully, her small face scrunched in concentration. "From people who want to take away the sweetness," she declared with the absolute certainty that only a 6-year-old could muster. The innocence of her answer struck Drevin like a gentle blow to the chest. In her simple worldview, the soldiers existed to protect sweetness, to guard against those who would steal joy and wonder from the world. If only life were that straightforward, he thought. If only the good guys always wore white hats and the battles were always clear, outside. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, creating rivulets that caught and scattered the streetlight like liquid diamonds. The October evening had settled into that comfortable darkness that made indoor spaces feel especially warm and welcoming. A few other patrons had drifted in, shaking rain from their coats and settling into the cafe's embrace. Drevin glanced at his watch. 7:30 p.m. They would need to head home soon. Callis had school tomorrow, and he had an early morning appointment with the Hendersons about rebuilding their back deck. The routine of their life was predictable, safe, manageable. He had built it that way deliberately, creating boundaries that would protect them both from the chaos and uncertainty that had once defined his world. "Can we get hot chocolate before we go?" Callis asked, already knowing the answer, but performing the ritual dance of request and permission that marked their evening routine. "With marshmallows?" Drevin asked, pretending to consider the gravity of the decision. "The little ones or the big ones?" "Definitely the little ones. Big marshmallows are for emergencies only." Callis giggled, a sound that never failed to lift Drevin's spirits. These moments, these simple exchanges filled with love and laughter, were what mattered most. This was the life he had chosen to build, one conversation, one shared smile, one evening ritual at a time. Betty appeared with 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, the little marshmallows already floating like tiny life preservers in the rich, dark liquid. "On the house," she said with a wink. "Rain day special." As Callis wrapped her small hands around the warm mug, being careful not to disturb her sugar packet guards, Drevin felt that familiar surge of contentment. This was enough. This quiet life they had built together, this peaceful routine, this safe harbor they called home. He had no way of knowing that in less than 10 minutes, everything would change. That a woman would stumble through the cafe door, bringing with her a storm that would make the gentle rain outside seem like nothing more than morning dew. That his daughter's voice, so full of innocent certainty, would soon speak the words that would transform their careful, quiet world into something he never could have imagined. But for now, there was only the warmth of the cafe, the sweetness of hot chocolate, and the soft sound of rain against glass, holding the world at bay for just a little longer. The warmth of Millbrook Cafe enveloped Drevin and Kellis like a familiar embrace, the kind of comfort that comes from belonging somewhere without reservation. This corner booth in the back section had unofficially become theirs over the past year, positioned perfectly to observe the gentle theater of small-town life while maintaining enough privacy for their father-daughter conversations. Drevin savored these moments, watching Kellis navigate her hot chocolate with the intense concentration of a surgeon performing delicate work. She had developed a system. First, count the marshmallows to ensure equal distribution, then sip carefully around the edges to avoid disturbing their careful arrangement, finally using her spoon to guide them into perfect formation for the final few sips. "Daddy, why do grown-ups always look so worried?" Kellis asked suddenly, her question emerging from that mysterious place where young minds make connections that adults have forgotten how to see. Drevin followed her gaze across the cafe, taking in the scene with fresh eyes. The businessman in the corner was indeed frowning at his phone, his shoulders hunched with tension. Two women at a table near the window spoke in hushed, urgent tones over barely touched coffee cups. Even Mrs. Abernathy, the retired librarian who usually radiated calm authority, seemed distracted as she stirred her tea with unusual vigor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Well, sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups forget to notice the good things because they're too busy worrying about the difficult things, Drevin said, choosing his words carefully. He had learned to navigate these philosophical discussions with Kellis, who had an uncanny ability to ask questions that cut straight to the heart of human nature. "But worrying doesn't fix anything, does it?" she observed with startling clarity. "No, it doesn't. But sometimes people worry instead of taking action because taking action feels scary." Kellis nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Like when I was scared to ride my bike without training wheels, but then I did it, and it wasn't scary anymore." "Exactly like that," Drevin agreed, marveling once again at his daughter's ability to distill complex truths into simple, actionable wisdom. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Hendricks, a fellow carpenter who worked primarily on the new housing developments sprouting up around Millbrook's expanding borders. Tommy slid into the booth across from them, his work clothes bearing the same honest stains that marked Drevin's daily uniform. "Evening, Drevin." "Hey there, Princess Kellis," Tommy said, tipping an imaginary hat to the little girl, who giggled at his theatrical greeting. "Tommy, how's the Morgan project coming?" Drevin asked, grateful for the company and the opportunity to talk shop with someone who understood the satisfaction of working with his hams. "Frustrating as hell," Tommy said, then quickly glanced at Kellis. "Sorry, kiddo. Frustrating as heck. These new developers, they want everything fast and cheap, but they also want it to look like something out of those fancy home magazines. They don't understand that quality takes time." Drevin nodded sympathetically. He had made the deliberate choice to work primarily on renovation and custom projects, preferring to work with homeowners who appreciated craftsmanship over speed. It meant less money sometimes, but it also meant he could take pride in every joint, every finish, every detail that would bear his reputation for decades to come. "Mrs. Pemberton showed me the design for her library built-ins yesterday," Drevin said. Hand-drawn sketches from her grandfather's workshop notes. The man was a true artisan. Dovetail joints, hidden hardware, wood selected not just for appearance, but for how it will age and develop character over time. "That's the difference," Tommy agreed. "People like Mrs. Pemberton understand that they're not just buying furniture. They're investing in something that will become part of their family story. These developers, they just see square footage and profit margins." Kellis had been listening to their conversation with the serious attention she gave to all adult discussions, occasionally nodding as if she understood the deeper implications of their trade philosophies. Betty appeared with a coffee for Tommy and fresh hot chocolate for Kellis. having anticipated their needs with the intuitive service that made Millbrook Cafe feel more like someone's kitchen than a commercial establishment. "You gentlemen discussing the state of honest work again?" Betty asked with a knowing smile. "Always," Drevin replied. "Tommy's dealing with developers who want miracles on impossible timelines." "Sounds familiar," Betty said, settling into the booth for a moment, clearly grateful for the excuse to rest her feet. "I had a corporate coffee chain scout in here last week, offering to buy me out. Said they could optimize the space for maximum customer throughput and profit efficiency." She shook her head with gentle disgust. "I told them that optimizing the soul out of a place isn't improvement. It's vandalism." The conversation that followed captured everything Drevin loved about their small community. Here were people who understood the difference between making a living and making a life, who valued relationships over profit margins, who built their businesses around serving their neighbors rather than extracting maximum value from anonymous consumers. Tommy talked about the veteran he had hired as an apprentice, a young man struggling to find his place after returning from overseas service. "Reminds me of myself 20 years ago," Tommy said. "Lost, angry, needing something real to focus on. Give a man a trade, teach him to build something with his hands, and you give him a foundation for rebuilding himself." Betty shared stories of the students who treated the cafe as their study hall, how she had watched them progress from anxious freshmen to confident graduates, how some of them still stopped by years later to share news of their careers, their marriages, their own young families. Drevin found himself thinking about his own journey, how carpentry had provided structure during his wildest years, how meeting Sarah had given him a reason to build a stable future, how losing her had nearly broken him before Callis reminded him that some things are too precious to abandon, no matter how much they hurt. "Daddy makes beautiful things," Callis announced suddenly, apparently deciding that the adults needed to understand this fundamental truth about her father. "He sure does, sweetheart," Betty agreed warmly. "Your daddy fixed my kitchen cabinets last spring, and they're still the prettiest cabinets in Millbrook. He's teaching me how to make a jewelry box for my treasures," Callis continued, warming to her subject. "With secret compartments and everything." "Secret compartments?" Tommy asked with exaggerated amazement. "That sounds like advanced carpentry to me." "It's not that advanced," Callis said seriously. "You just have to think about where someone would want to hide something special, and then you make a place for it." The adults exchanged glances over her head, struck once again by the startling wisdom that occasionally emerged from her young perspective. "Where someone would want to hide something special, and then you make a place for it." It was perhaps the most accurate description of what made a house become a home that any of them had ever heard. As the evening progressed, their corner of the cafe became a small island of community connection. Other patrons occasionally joined the conversation, Mrs. Chun discussing her plans for a reading garden behind the library, young Pastor Williams sharing his vision for a youth center that would give local teenagers a safe place to gather, Dr. Sarah Hendricks talking about the mobile clinic she hoped to establish for elderly residents who had difficulty traveling to medical appointments. These were the conversations that reinforced Drevin's choice to build his life in Millbrook. Here, people still knew each other's names, still cared about each other's dreams, still believed that individual actions could make a meaningful difference in their shared community. It wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it was real, authentic, grounded in values that went deeper than profit margins and efficiency metrics. Callis had fallen asleep in the booth, her head pillowed on her arms, her breathing slow and peaceful. The sugar packet soldiers still stood guard over their makeshift castle, a testament to her unwavering belief in the importance of protecting sweetness from those who would steal it away. Drevin looked at his daughter's sleeping face, so peaceful and trusting, and felt the familiar surge of protective love that had defined his life since the moment she was born. Everything he built, every choice he made, every priority he set, it all came back to her, to creating a world where her natural optimism and kindness could flourish. Without being crushed by cynicism or cruelty, the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, and the cafe's warmth seemed to deepen as the evening settled around them. In a few minutes, he would gently wake Kellis and guide her sleepy steps to the truck, where she would curl up in her car seat for the short drive home. Tomorrow would bring another day of honest work, another evening of shared stories, another small step in the careful construction of the life they were building. Together, none of them could have imagined that their peaceful world was about to collide with forces that would test everything they thought they knew about courage, justice, and the true cost of standing up for what's right. But tonight, there was only warmth, community, and the quiet satisfaction of belonging somewhere that felt like home. The soft chime of the cafe door should have been just another gentle note in the evening's peaceful symphony, but something about this particular entrance made Drevin look up from his conversation with Tommy. 3 men stepped into Millbrook Cafe, and immediately the atmosphere shifted, like the atmospheric pressure drop that precedes a severe storm. They weren't dressed like the usual evening patrons. Where most people who came to Betty's Cafe wore the comfortable clothes of small-town life, flannel shirts, worn jeans, practical footwear, these 3 men were wrapped in expensive suits that seemed out of place under the warm, amber lighting. Their shoes gleamed with the kind of polish that suggested they had never walked on anything more challenging than polished marble floors, but it wasn't their clothes that triggered Drevin's instincts. It was their eyes. Cold, calculating, constantly scanning the room as if cataloging weaknesses and escape routes. These were predators, and Drevin's protective instincts, honed by years of keeping Calais safe in an unpredictable world, immediately went on high alert. The tallest of the 3, a man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of practiced smile that never reached his eyes, approached Betty at the counter. His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation dressed as courtesy. "Good evening," he said, his tone pleasant but somehow threatening. "We're looking for someone who might have stopped in here tonight." A woman, about 5'6", dark hair, probably looking nervous or distressed. Betty's response was immediate and protective. She had been serving this community for over 20 years, and she knew the difference between legitimate concern and predatory hunting. "I'm sorry, but I don't discuss my customers with strangers," she said firmly. The man's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps you misunderstood. We're with Cromwell Security Consulting. This woman is in considerable danger, and we're here to help her." "Then perhaps you should contact the police," Betty replied, her voice carrying the steel that had allowed her to maintain order in her cafe during everything from teenage drama to adult disagreements. "They're trained to handle situations involving people in danger." The second man, shorter but with the compact build of someone who stayed in excellent physical condition, leaned against the counter in a way that was meant to appear casual but came across as subtly threatening. "The police aren't equipped to handle this particular type of danger," he said. "We have specialized training." Tommy had stopped mid-sentence in his conversation with Drevin, both men now paying careful attention to the exchange at the counter. Other patrons had also begun to take notice, conversations dying down as people unconsciously responded to the tension that had entered their peaceful refuge. Drevin carefully shifted his position so that his body was between the sleeping Callis and the 3 strangers. His movement was subtle, practiced, the automatic response of a father who had spent years positioning himself as the first line of defense for his daughter. The third man, who had remained silent until now, spoke up from his position near the door. "We know she's been in contact with local residents. Someone matching her description was seen entering this establishment approximately 90 minutes ago." "Seen by whom?" Betty asked, her protective instincts now fully engaged. "And why exactly should I believe that you're the good guys in this situation?" The tall man's facade of polite professionalism began to crack. "Ma'am, we're trying to prevent a very dangerous situation from escalating." This woman has information that could put innocent people at risk. We need to locate her immediately. What kind of information? Dr. Hendricks asked from her table near the window. As the town's only physician, she was accustomed to asking direct questions when people's safety was at stake. The three men exchanged quick glances, clearly not expecting to face organized questioning from multiple community members. Their presence had been meant to intimidate a single business owner into compliance, not to justify themselves to an entire room full of concerned neighbors. That's classified information, the compact man said curtly. We're not at liberty to discuss the details of an ongoing investigation. Investigation by whom? Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying the gentle authority that made him effective at mediating community disputes. What organization are you gentlemen representing, exactly? The tension in the room continued to escalate as more patrons turned their attention to the confrontation. Mrs. Chen set down her book and removed her reading glasses, preparing to focus completely on the situation. The university students had closed their laptops and were watching, with the intense attention that comes from recognizing that something significant is happening. Drevin noticed that all three men wore identical watches, expensive chronographs that seemed more tactical than decorative. They moved with the coordinated precision of a team that had worked together before, positioning themselves to control different areas of the cafe. Most telling of all, the man by the door had positioned himself to block the most direct exit route. These weren't security consultants responding to an emergency. These were hunters who had lost track of their prey and were trying to intimidate the local population into helping them continue the chase. I think it's time for you gentlemen to leave, Betty said firmly. If you have legitimate concerns about someone's safety, take them to the proper authorities. This is a place of business, not an interrogation center. The tall man's mask of professionalism finally slipped completely. This isn't a request, lady. We have reason to believe that you're harboring someone who poses a significant security risk. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but we're not leaving empty-handed. That was when Drevin stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate, measured movement of someone who had made a decision and was preparing to act on it. Tommy immediately followed his lead, recognizing the shift in his friend's demeanor. Actually, Drevin said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who wasn't looking for trouble, but wouldn't back down from it either. I think Betty made herself pretty clear. This is her establishment, and she's asked you to leave. The compact man turned to face Drevin directly, clearly sizing him up as a potential threat. This doesn't concern you, Carpenter. Stay out of it and nobody gets hurt. The casual mention of Drevin's profession confirmed what he had already suspected. These men had done their homework, probably identifying and researching every regular patron of the cafe. They weren't just looking for one woman. They were prepared to intimidate an entire community to get what they wanted. When strangers come into our neighborhood and start threatening our friends, it becomes our concern, Tommy said, stepping up beside Drevin. Maybe it's time for you boys to move along. The atmosphere in the cafe had transformed completely. What had been a peaceful evening of community connection had become a tense standoff between locals and outsiders, between people protecting their neighbors and predators, hunting their quarry. Dr. Hendricks had quietly moved to a position where she could reach her phone quickly if medical assistance became necessary. Pastor Williams had stood up, placing himself between the confrontation and the elderly Mrs. Chun, who was watching the proceedings with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The man by the door spoke into a small communication device attached to his collar, his voice too low for anyone in the cafe to understand the words. But his intention was clear. He was calling for backup or reporting on the situation to someone in authority. That was when the cafe door opened again, and the woman they were hunting stumbled inside. She was exactly as the tall man had described, about 5'6", dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing clothes that suggested she had been traveling hard and fast. But what struck Drevin immediately wasn't her appearance. It was her eyes. They held the particular combination of exhaustion and desperate determination that he recognized from his own mirror. During the darkest days after Sarah's death, this was someone who had been running, not from justice, but toward it. Someone who had sacrificed everything safe and comfortable in her life to do what she believed was right, and was now facing the terrible cost of that choice. The woman took one look at the three men and immediately understood her mistake. She had walked directly into the trap they had set for her, and now she was surrounded by predators in a room full of innocent people who could become collateral damage in whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Her eyes swept the room quickly, taking in the faces of the community members who had unconsciously arranged themselves into a protective formation around Betty's counter. When her gaze met Dreven's, he saw something that made his decision for him. She wasn't asking for help. She was apologizing for bringing danger into this peaceful place where families came to share hot chocolate and neighbors came to connect with each other. She was preparing to sacrifice herself to protect people she had never met, because that was the kind of person she was. That was when Kellis woke up, took one look at the scene unfolding around their booth, and whispered the words that would change everything. "Daddy, she's in trouble." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down by innocence itself, cutting through all the adult complexity and political maneuvering to expose the simple, undeniable truth of the situation. Kellis had awakened to find their peaceful cafe transformed into something resembling a standoff, and her 6-year-old moral compass had immediately identified the essential reality. Someone needed help. Someone needed help. Dreven looked down at his daughter, who was now sitting up in the booth, her auburn curls disheveled from sleep, her green eyes wide with concern but not fear. Even at 6 years old, Kellis possessed an uncanny ability to see through surface complications to the heart of any situation. She didn't understand corporate espionage or security consultants or whatever larger forces were at play here. She simply saw a woman who was afraid and men who were causing that fear. "Daddy, she's in trouble," Kellis repeated, more urgently this time, her small hand reaching out to grasp Dreven's wrist. "Look at her face. She's scared, just like I was when I got lost at the county fair, remember?" The comparison hit Dreven like a physical blow. He did remember that day, 3 months ago, when Kellis had wandered away from him in the crowded fairgrounds and spent 20 terrifying minutes convinced she would never find her way back to safety. When he had finally located her, she had looked exactly like the woman standing frozen in the cafe doorway, exhausted, desperately hopeful, and trying to be brave in the face of overwhelming circumstances. The woman in question had pressed herself against the door, as if she might somehow melt through it and disappear. Her dark eyes darted between the 3 men and the exit, calculating odds that clearly weren't in her favor. She wore simple jeans and a navy sweater that had seen better days, and carried a worn leather messenger bag clutched against her chest like armor, but it was her posture that told the real story. This wasn't someone running from consequences of her own making. This was someone who had discovered something terrible and was trying to do the right thing about it, despite the personal cost. Dreven recognized the particular way she held herself, the stance of someone who had accepted that doing what's right might require sacrificing everything safe and comfortable in her life. The tall man who appeared to be the leader of the 3-person hunting party noticed the woman at the same moment Kellis spoke. His cold smile returned, but now it carried genuine menace rather than false courtesy. "Tavira," he said, and the way he pronounced her name made it sound like a verdict. "There you are. You've caused us quite a lot of trouble tonight." So her name was Tavira. Dreven filed that information away while continuing to process the dynamics of the situation. The use of her first name suggested a familiarity that went beyond professional. Hunting, these people had worked together before, or at least knew each other well enough to dispense with formal courtesy. "Marcus told us you'd probably run to ground somewhere like this," the compact man added, gesturing dismissively at the cafe's warm, welcoming atmosphere. "Someplace cozy and civilian, where you could hide behind innocent people. The contempt in his voice when he said innocent people told Drevin everything he needed to know about how these three viewed the community members they were prepared to threaten and intimidate. To them, the regular patrons of Millbrook Cafe weren't human beings with their own rights and dignity. They were simply obstacles, to be moved or leveraged to be used. Tavira straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that belied her exhausted appearance. I'm not hiding behind anyone. I came here because I needed to think, and this seemed like a place where people still believed in common decency. Common decency doesn't pay the bills, sweetheart, the third man said from his position by the door. And it definitely doesn't protect you from the consequences of stealing proprietary information. I didn't steal anything, Tavira said firmly. I documented criminal activity and reported it through proper channels. The fact that those channels were compromised doesn't make me a thief, the exchange revealed. Layers of context that helped Drevin understand the stakes involved. This wasn't just about one woman running from corporate security. This was about someone who had discovered wrongdoing, tried to report it legitimately, and found herself targeted for elimination when the people she trusted turned out to be part of the problem. Betty had moved closer to the phone behind her counter, her hand hovering near the receiver as she calculated whether calling the police would help or escalate the situation. Dr. Hendricks had positioned herself where she could assist if anyone got injured, while Pastor Williams had begun moving the elderly Mrs. Chun toward the back exit, just in case things went badly. But Kellis was still focused on the essential moral question that adults seemed determined to complicate with considerations of safety, legality, and political complexity. She tugged on Drevin's sleeve again, more insistently this time. Daddy, are we going to help her? She asked, her voice carrying the assumption that of course they would help, because helping people was what good people did when they encountered others in trouble. The question hung in the cafe air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Every person in the room, community members and predators, alike understood that this 6-year-old had just articulated the choice that would define not just the next few minutes, but the kind of people they were and the kind of community they had built together. Drevin felt the weight of multiple responsibilities pressing down on him simultaneously. His primary obligation was to protect Kellis, to ensure that his daughter didn't become collateral damage in whatever conflict these strangers had brought into their peaceful refuge. But he also felt the pull of the values he had tried to instill in her through years of bedtime stories and everyday examples. The belief that strong people protect weak people, that right and wrong aren't negotiable based on convenience, that sometimes standing up for others is worth accepting personal risk. He looked around the cafe at the faces of his neighbors and friends, people who had become his chosen family in the years since Sarah's death. Betty, who had never charged him for the countless cups of coffee during those early months when he could barely afford groceries and needed human connection more than caffeine. Tommy, who had shared carpentry jobs and helped him learn to balance single parenthood with running his own business. Dr. Hendricks, who had taken care of Kellis through every childhood illness with the gentle competence that made her beloved. Throughout the community, these people had created something precious here, a space where individuals mattered, where neighbors looked out for each other, where a single father and his daughter could find acceptance and support without having to prove their worth or navigate complex social hierarchies. It was the kind of community that existed only when people were willing to stand up for shared values, even when standing up involved personal risk. The tall man was getting impatient with the extended silence. "This is a private matter," he announced to the room. "Everyone just needs to mind their own business, and nobody gets hurt." But that was exactly wrong, Drevin realized. This couldn't be a private matter anymore, because the moment these three had brought their hunt into Millbrook Cafe, they had made it everyone's business. They had violated the sanctuary of the community gathering place, threatened Betty's authority in her own establishment, and demonstrated their willingness to intimidate innocent people to achieve their goals. Most importantly, they had done all of this in front of Kalis, who was now waiting for the adults around her to demonstrate whether the values they had taught her through words and stories would hold up when tested by real-world pressures. "Daddy?" she said again, more quietly this time, but with complete trust that he would make the right choice. Drevin looked down at his daughter's face, so full of faith in him and in the basic goodness of the world they had built together. Then he looked at Tavira, who was still pressed against the door, resigned to facing whatever came next but refusing to compromise others in her struggle for survival. Finally, he looked at the three predators who had invaded their community space and were now demanding that everyone ignore their conscience and abandon a person in need because it would be more convenient and safer to do so. The choice, when he saw it clearly, wasn't really a choice at all. Drevin stood up slowly, placing himself between his daughter and the three strangers, but also between Tavira and the men who were hunting her. His movement was deliberate, unmistakable in its meaning, and it sent ripples of decision through the room as other community members recognized what was happening and began to choose their own positions. "Kalis is right," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had made peace with the consequences of his decision. "She's in trouble, and we don't abandon people who are in trouble, especially not in our own neighborhood." The words, once spoken, changed everything. The peaceful Tuesday evening at Millbrook Cafe was over, and whatever came next would test everything they thought they knew about courage, community, and the price of standing up for what's right. The moment Drevin spoke those words, the atmosphere in Millbrook Cafe shifted from tense standoff to something far more dangerous and decisive. He had crossed the invisible line between observer and participant, between someone hoping trouble would pass them by and someone willing to stand directly in its path. The three hunting predators immediately recognized the change, their body language shifting from casual intimidation to focused threat assessment. The tall man's cold smile vanished entirely, replaced by the calculating expression of someone reassessing his tactical situation. "You're making a very serious mistake, Carpenter," he said, his voice dropping to the low, controlled tone that preceded violence. "This woman is a corporate spy who has stolen proprietary information worth millions of dollars. Interfering with our recovery operation makes you an accessory to industrial espionage." But Drevin had spent years learning to read people's intentions through their actions rather than their words. During his most difficult period after Sarah's death, when grief had made him suspicious of everyone's motives, he had developed an instinct for distinguishing between those who meant what they said and those who used words as weapons. These three men moved like predators, spoke like bureaucrats, and threatened like criminals, whatever they were. They weren't legitimate security consultants. If she's really a spy and you're really corporate security, then you should have no problem calling the local police and letting them handle the situation according to proper legal procedures. Drevin replied evenly. "Unless, of course, you're not who you claim to be." Tommy stepped up beside his friend, understanding without words that they were now committed to this course of action together. "I've worked with plenty of corporate security teams on construction sites," he added. "They carry proper identification, work through established legal channels, and they definitely don't threaten entire communities to get compliance." Dr. Hendricks had moved closer to Tavira, her medical training automatically focusing on the woman's obvious exhaustion and stress. "You look like you haven't eaten or slept properly in days," she said gently. "Why don't you sit down and let me check your blood pressure?" The simple offer of medical care, professional, compassionate, and completely focused on human need rather than political complications, seemed to break something loose in Tavira's carefully maintained composure. Her eyes filled with tears that she immediately tried to blink away. "I can't," she whispered. "These people, they've been hunting me for 3 days. Anyone who helps me becomes a target. I can't do that to you." "Honey," Betty said firmly, moving out from behind her counter with the authority of someone who had been making decisions about who was Welcome in her establishment for over 2 decades. You let us worry about what we can and can't handle. Right now, you look like someone who needs coffee, food, and a safe place to rest." The compact man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Safe place? Lady, you have no idea what you're dealing with. This woman has information that could bring down entire corporations, destroy thousands of jobs, ruin innocent people's lives. You think your little coffee shop can protect her from the kind of resources that are being brought to bear?" Pastor Williams had been listening carefully to the entire exchange, his trained ear catching the subtle inconsistencies in the 3 men's story. If she really has information that could destroy innocent people's lives, then shouldn't that information be investigated by proper authorities rather than suppressed by private security teams? He asked mildly. The question hung in the air, exposing the logical flaw in their intimidation strategy. If Tavira possessed evidence of genuine wrongdoing, then the appropriate response would be investigation and legal action, not the kind of aggressive suppression tactics these 3 were employing. Callis had been watching the adult conversation with the intense focus she brought to any situation where important decisions were being made. Now she slipped out of the booth and walked directly to Tavira, moving with the fearless compassion that only comes from a young person's absolute faith in the basic goodness of the world. "Hi," she said, looking up at the exhausted woman with eyes full of warmth and concern. "I'm Kellis. My daddy makes beautiful things with wood, and Betty makes the best hot chocolate in the whole world. Would you like to sit with us? We have extra marshmallows." The offer was so simple, so purely kind, that it seemed to physically stagger Tavira. She knelt down to Callis's level, her professional composure finally cracking completely, as she found herself face to face with uncomplicated human decency. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart," she said softly. "But these men are right about one thing. I am in serious trouble, and being around me might not be safe for you and your daddy." Callis considered this with the serious attention she gave to all important information, then nodded as if reaching a conclusion. "Daddy always says that keeping people safe is more important than being safe," she announced. "And you need keeping safe right now." The 6-year-old's moral clarity cut through every adult complexity and political calculation in the room, reducing the entire situation to its essential truth. Someone needed help, and helping people was what good people did. Regardless of personal risk or inconvenience, Drevin felt his heart swell with pride at his daughter's courage, even as his protective instincts screamed warnings about the danger she was potentially walking into. This was the moment every parent fears and hopes for simultaneously, the moment when your individual becomes strong enough to make their own moral choices, even when those choices involve risk. The man by the door had grown tired of the extended discussion. "Enough," he said curtly, reaching inside his jacket for what was undoubtedly a weapon of some kind. "We have authorization to use whatever force is necessary to complete this recovery operation. Stand aside or deal with the consequences." That was when Drevin's training kicked in, not military training, which he had never possessed, but the deeper, more fundamental training that comes from years of working with dangerous tools, navigating hazardous job sites, and learning to stay calm under pressure when other people's safety depends on your decisions. He moved with deliberate precision, placing himself directly between the armed man and Callis, while simultaneously positioning his body to shield both his daughter and Tavira. His movement wasn't aggressive or challenging, it was simply immovable, the stance of someone who had decided where he would stand and would not be moved from that position by threats or force. "Tommy," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the 3 predators, "would you mind escorting Callis to the kitchen area? I think Betty might have some special cookies back there that need taste testing." Tommy understood immediately, moving to gather Callis and guide her toward the relative safety of the cafe's back areas. But Callis resisted, her small hand reaching out toward Tavira with the stubborn determination that Drevin recognized as his own temperament reflected in miniature. She should come too, Callis insisted. Everyone should come. We can all have cookies together, and maybe these men will remember how to be nice. The innocent suggestion that sharing cookies might somehow transform predators into reasonable people would have been laughable, if not for the absolute sincerity with which it was offered. Callis genuinely believed that human goodness was stronger than human cruelty, and that even the most dangerous situations could be resolved through kindness and shared humanity. Her faith was about to be tested in ways that no 6-year-old should ever have to experience. The tall man had clearly reached the end of his patience with community discussion and moral philosophy. "This is your final warning," he announced to the room. "Anyone who interferes with our operation will be considered a hostile combatant and dealt with accordingly." Betty moved to the phone behind her counter, but the compact man was faster, vaulting over the counter with surprising agility and placing his hand over the receiver before she could dial. "No police," he said firmly. "This is a matter of national security, and local law enforcement doesn't have the clearance to handle classified information." The claim was obviously fabricated. If this really were a legitimate national security operation, they would have proper identification, legal warrants, and official support rather than threats and intimidation. But the implications were clear. These three were prepared to prevent any outside intervention by whatever means necessary. Dr. Hendricks had quietly moved to a position where she could reach her cell phone, but the man by the door noticed her movement and shook his head meaningfully. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt to call for help would result in immediate escalation to violence. The cafe that had been a sanctuary of community warmth and connection just minutes earlier had been transformed into a trap, with innocent people caught between predators and their prey. Every person in the room now faced the same choice Drevin had made: submit to intimidation and abandon someone in desperate need, or stand up for their values regardless of personal cost. Pastor Williams was the next to make his decision, stepping forward to stand beside Drevin in the protective formation that was slowly forming between the predators and their target. "I've seen enough bullies in my time to recognize them," he said calmly. "Real security professionals don't threaten communities or prevent people from calling for legal assistance." Mrs. Chun, despite her age and apparent fragility, moved to join them as well, her eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made her a formidable educator for 4 decades before her retirement. "Young men," she said with the authority that had once commanded respect from generations of students, "your behavior is absolutely unacceptable. You will leave this establishment immediately, or we will make you leave. Or we will make you leave." One by one, the community members who had come to Millbrook Cafe for nothing more than coffee, conversation, and connection found themselves choosing between safety and values, between self-preservation and standing up for what they knew was right. 3 predators found themselves facing not just one stubborn carpenter, but an entire community that had decided to protect one of their own, even though Tavira wasn't actually one of their own yet. She was simply someone in trouble who had stumbled into their sanctuary, and that was enough. The standoff had reached its crucial moment. Whatever happened next would determine not just Tavira's fate, but the kind of community Millbrook would continue to be: a place where people protected each other, or a place where fear and intimidation could override moral courage when the stakes got high enough. Drevin looked down at Callis, who was still holding Tavira's hand with complete trust that the adults around her would find a way to make everything turn out right. Her faith in their collective goodness was about to be tested by fire, and he prayed that they would prove worthy of her trust. The threshold had been crossed. There was no turning back now. The standoff in Millbrook Calf reached its breaking point when the sound of powerful engines cut through the tension like thunder rolling across a clear sky. 3 vehicles pulled into the small parking lot outside, not the unmarked sedans or tactical vans that might accompany a legitimate security operation, but 3 gleaming Ferrari 488 GTBs in midnight black, their engines purring with barely contained power. The arrival was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the modest small-town setting that everyone in the cafe, predators and community members, alike turned to stare through the rain-streaked windows at the automotive spectacle unfolding outside. "What the hell?" the compact man muttered, his professional composure cracking as he watched three figures in expensive suits emerge from the supercars. With military precision, Tavira's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the fear or resignation that had marked her demeanor since arriving at the cafe, her posture straightened, her chin lifted, and suddenly she looked less like a hunted fugitive and more like someone accustomed to command authority in high-stakes situations. "About time," she said quietly, her voice carrying the strength that made everyone in the room reassess their assumptions about who she really was. The lead Ferrari's driver stepped through the cafe door with the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted their welcome anywhere. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Dreven's monthly income, and when he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of executive privilege. "Ms. Morwen," he said with a slight bow of respect, "we've been looking for you. Your security detail was quite concerned when you didn't arrive at the scheduled location, Ms. Morwen." The name hit the room like a physical force, and several people, including Dr. Hendricks and Pastor Williams, audibly gasped as recognition dawned. Tavira Morwen wasn't just some corporate whistleblower running from security consultants. She was Tavira Morwen, CEO and founder of Morwen Industries, one of the most influential technology companies in the world, with a personal net worth that put her among the most powerful women in America. Betty's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor in a cascade of ceramic fragments and liquid that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent cafe. The woman she had been ready to defend with motherly ferocity, the exhausted fugitive she had offered coffee and sanctuary, was someone who could have bought the entire town of Millbrook without denting her quarterly earnings statement. The three original predators had gone pale, clearly recognizing that their intimidation tactics had just escalated from corporate harassment to something approaching assault on one of the most legally protected individuals in the country. The tall man who had been their spokesman took an involuntary step backward, his confident demeanor evaporating as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. "There's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice now carrying the desperate edge of panic. "We were told she was an industrial spy, someone who had stolen proprietary information. We were just trying to recover stolen assets." The Ferrari driver, clearly head of Tavira's actual security detail, regarded the three men with the kind of cold, professional assessment that police officers reserve for particularly stupid criminals. "You were told incorrectly," he said with deadly quiet. "Ms. Morwen is the victim of corporate espionage, not the perpetrator. She's been gathering evidence of systematic fraud within her own company, carried out by individuals who apparently thought they could intimidate her into silence." Tavira stepped forward, and suddenly the exhausted, frightened woman was gone, replaced by the executive presence that had built a technology empire from a single innovative idea. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that moved stock markets and reshaped entire industries. "Gentlemen," she said, addressing the three men who had been hunting her with the cold politeness reserved for particularly incompetent subordinates, "I believe we need to have a conversation about your employment status. My legal team will be very interested in discussing your methods of persuasion." The transformation was so complete, so startling, that Callis tugged on her father's shirt and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Daddy, is she a secret princess?" The innocent question broke some of the tension in the room, drawing scattered chuckles from the community members who were still processing the revelation. Dreven knelt down to his daughter's level, trying to find words that would help a 6-year-old understand what they had just witnessed. "Not a princess, sweetheart," he said gently, "but someone very important who was in trouble and needed our help, and we helped her." Callis announced with satisfaction, as if the successful completion of their good deed was the only detail that really mattered. Tavira turned to look at the little girl who had been the first to recognize her distress, whose simple moral clarity had sparked the chain of events that led to her rescue. When she knelt down to Kellis's eye level, her executive authority softened into something warmer and more personal. "Yes, you did help me," she said softly. "You and your father and all these wonderful people helped me when I needed it most, even though you didn't know who I was or why I was running. That's what neighbors do," Kellis replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had guided her actions throughout the evening. "We help each other." Standing up, Tavira addressed the entire room, her voice carrying genuine emotion beneath its professional composure. "I want to thank all of you. When I walked through that door tonight, I was running from people I thought I could trust, carrying evidence of criminal activity within my own company, with nowhere safe to turn. You didn't know anything about me, but you were willing to stand up to dangerous men to protect a stranger." She paused, looking around at the faces of the community members who had transformed from cafe patrons into an impromptu defense force. "That kind of courage, that kind of integrity, is rarer than you might think in my world." The head of her security detail had been coordinating quietly with someone on his phone, and now he approached Tavira with the deference due to his employer. "Ma'am, the FBI task force is en route to take these three into custody. The evidence you gathered has been corroborated through multiple sources, and there are warrants being prepared for at least 12 co-conspirators, the three predators who had seemed so threatening just minutes earlier now looked like what they actually were: mid-level criminals who had overplayed their hand and were about to face the full consequences of attacking someone with the resources to fight back effectively." But Tavira's attention had turned to something else entirely. She was looking at Drevin with the kind of focused intensity that he recognized from clients who were envisioning a major construction project. "Mr. Thorsell," she said, having somehow learned his name during the evening's chaos, "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you're willing. I have a proposition that might interest you." Tani raised an eyebrow at his friend, clearly wondering what kind of proposition a billionaire CEO might have for a small-town carpenter. Dr. Hendricks looked equally curious, while Betty was still staring at Tavira as if she might suddenly transform into someone else entirely. But it was Pastor Williams who voiced what everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, with all due respect, what could someone in your position possibly need from someone in ours?" Tavira smiled, and for the first time since entering the cafe, she looked genuinely relaxed. "Pastor, in my experience, the most valuable thing in the world isn't money or technology or market share. It's the kind of character that leads people to protect strangers without expecting anything in return." She gestured around the cafe, taking in the community members who were still processing the evening's revelations. "You've built something here that my industry desperately needs: authentic integrity, genuine concern for others, the kind of values that can't be manufactured or purchased." Drevin felt a familiar stirring, the same instinct that had led him to stand up earlier in the evening. This wasn't just about gratitude or reward for services rendered. This was about something bigger, something that could potentially transform not just his life, but the kind of future he was building for Kellis. "What kind of proposition?" he asked carefully, his carpenter's instincts automatically assessing the structural integrity of any offer before committing to it. Tavira's smile widened, and suddenly she looked less like a corporate executive and more like someone who had just recognized a kindred spirit. "The kind that could turn your small-town carpentry skills into a blueprint for rebuilding trust in corporate America," she said. "But that's a conversation that deserves more privacy and much better coffee than we're likely to get tonight." Outside, the sound of sirens was growing closer, promising resolution to the immediate threat while opening the door to possibilities that none of them could have imagined when the evening began with nothing more ambitious than hot chocolate and sugar packet soldiers. The revelation had changed everything, but the real transformation was just beginning. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Thornwick Valley, the kind of October day that made the maple trees look like they were on fire with brilliant orange and gold. Drevin stood in his workshop behind the house, running his hands over a piece of cherry wood that would become part of Mrs. Pemberton's library built-ins, but his mind was still processing the surreal events of the previous evening. The three Ferraris were parked in his driveway, an incongruity so complete that his neighbors had been walking by all morning, some pretending to walk their dogs multiple times, others simply stopping to stare at the automotive display that had transformed his modest property into something resembling a luxury car showcase. Khalees, characteristically unfazed by the dramatic change in their circumstances, had spent breakfast designing what she called fancy car flowers to put on each vehicle, because even fancy cars need to feel pretty. She was currently arranging dandelions and autumn leaves across the hood of the nearest Ferrari, while Tavira's security detail watched with barely concealed amusement. Tavira herself had arrived an hour earlier, dressed in well-fitted jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look more like an upscale suburban mother than a billionaire CEO. She had spent the first 20 minutes playing with Khalees, admiring the workshop, and asking intelligent questions about Drevin's carpentry techniques with the kind of genuine interest that couldn't be faked. Now she sat across from him at his workbench, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, waiting patiently while he processed the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Drevin said, setting down his coffee and leaning back against the workshop wall. "You want to create a network of community-based technology centers, staffed by local craftspeople and trade workers, designed to teach digital skills through hands-on projects that actually matter to the communities they serve." Tavira nodded, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that had probably driven her initial success in building More Industries. Traditional tech education focuses on abstract programming concepts and theoretical frameworks. But most people learn better when they can see immediate, practical applications for new skills. She gestured toward the workshop around them, taking, in the carefully organized tools, the half-finished projects, the evidence of craftsmanship that went far beyond simple functionality. "You understand something that most tech executives have forgotten, that building things with your hands teaches you to think differently about problems. It develops patience, attention to detail, pride in workmanship, and the ability to troubleshoot when things don't go according to plan." Drevin had to admit that her analysis resonated with his own experience. Some of his most satisfying projects had involved combining traditional woodworking techniques with modern tools and materials, finding ways to honor old craftsmanship, traditions while embracing innovations that made the work more efficient and precise. "But why me?" he asked. "I'm not a technology expert. I barely understand half the features on my smartphone." "That's exactly why I need you," Tavira replied immediately. "The technology industry is full of people who can write code and design interfaces, but it's desperately short of people who understand how to teach practical skills too. Individuals who might be intimidated by traditional educational approaches." She pulled out a tablet and showed him architectural renderings of a facility that looked nothing like the sterile computer labs he remembered from Callis's elementary school. Instead, it resembled a high-end workshop with stations that combined traditional crafting tools with cutting-edge digital fabrication equipment. Imagine teaching someone to design furniture using 3D modeling software, then actually building the pieces using CNC routers and laser cutters, she explained. Or helping local small business owners understand e-commerce by creating their own websites to showcase products they make with their own hands. The vision was compelling, but Drevin's natural caution made him probe for potential problems. "What's the business model? How does this make money for your company?" Tavira's expression grew more serious, and he caught a glimpse of the strategic thinking that had built her empire. "Honestly, the direct financial return is minimal, but the indirect benefits could be enormous. We're facing a crisis of trust in the technology industry. People feel like tech companies extract value from their communities without giving anything meaningful back. She paused, sipping her coffee while choosing her words carefully. The corporate espionage I uncovered isn't just about stealing trade secrets or manipulating stock prices. It's part of a broader pattern of tech companies treating local communities as resources to be exploited rather than partners to be supported. And you think community workshops will solve that problem? Drevin asked, not skeptically, but genuinely curious about her reasoning. I think they're a start, she replied. When tech companies actually invest in developing local talent, when they create facilities that serve community needs rather than just corporate interests, when they demonstrate that they value craftsmanship and practical skills alongside abstract innovation, they start rebuilding the social trust that the industry has squandered. Through the workshop window, Drevin could see Kayla showing one of the security guards how to make a proper leaf crown. Her instructions delivered with the patient authority of someone teaching an important life skill. The image crystallized, something that had been bothering him about Tavira's proposal. What happens to places like this? He asked, gesturing around his workshop. What happens to small-scale craftspeople when you bring in high-tech fabrication equipment and corporate resources? It was the right question, and Tavira's immediate smile told him she had been hoping he would ask it. That's the most important part of the whole concept, she said. This isn't about replacing traditional craftsmanship with technology. It's about using technology to amplify and preserve traditional skills. She showed him more renderings on her tablet spaces where master craftspeople worked alongside computer programmers, where traditional techniques were documented and preserved using digital tools, where young people could learn both time-tested methods and cutting-edge innovations. Think of it as building bridges, she continued. Bridges between old skills and new tools, between individual craftsmanship and community development, between corporate resources and local needs. The metaphor resonated with Drevin's understanding of construction projects. The best bridges weren't just functional connections between 2 points, they were structures that honored the landscape they traversed while opening up new possibilities for everyone who crossed them. What would my role be in all this? He asked. I want you to be the prototype, Tavira said simply. The first community workshop leader, the person who helps us figure out how to make this vision actually work in practice. You'd maintain your carpentry business, but you'd also develop curricula, train other workshop leaders, and serve as a public face for the program. The scope of what she was describing was both exciting and intimidating. Drevin had never seen himself as someone who could represent a major corporate initiative or serve as a model for others to follow. His strength lay in working with his hands, building things one piece at a time, solving problems through patience and careful attention to detail. But then he thought about the conversation at Millbrook Cafe the night before, the way community members had talked about their dreams for local development youth programs, skills training, economic opportunities that would let young people build careers without leaving their hometowns. How would we measure success? He asked, falling back on the practical questions that helped him evaluate any major project. Enrollment numbers, job placement rates, local business development statistics, Tavira replied promptly. But also, less quantifiable metrics, community cohesion, individual confidence building, the kind of social capital that develops when people feel empowered to create things they're proud of. She paused, then added more quietly, and whether we can demonstrate that technology companies can actually serve communities instead of just extracting value from them. Drevin stood up and walked to the window, watching Callis continue her patient instruction in leaf crown construction. His daughter had no concept of corporate strategy or economic development, but she understood something fundamental about teaching and learning, that the best education happens when someone who cares takes time to show someone else how to create something beautiful. I'd want guarantees, he said finally. Not just for me, but for the community. Protections to ensure that this program serves local needs, not just corporate public relations objectives. Of course, Tavira replied immediately. I'd want you to help write those protections into the foundational structure of the program. And I'd want to start small. Prove the concept works here before expanding to other communities. Absolutely. Millbrook would be the pilot location, the place where we work out all the problems before taking the model elsewhere. Drevin turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had made her proposal, he allowed himself to imagine what success might look like. Young people from Thornwick Valley learning skills that would let them build careers close to home. Local businesses developing the digital capabilities they needed to compete in modern markets. Master craftspeople sharing their knowledge with new generations while learning to integrate new tools into traditional techniques. There's one more thing, he said. Callis would need to be part of this somehow. Not in any formal role, but as a reminder of why we're doing it. She has a way of cutting through complex problems to find the simple truths. Underneath, Tavira's smile was warm and genuine. I was hoping you'd say that. Some of the best innovations come from seeing familiar problems through young eyes. Outside, Callis had apparently finished her tutorial, because the security guard was now wearing an elaborate crown of autumn leaves while she applauded his efforts. The image encapsulated everything Drevin loved about his daughter, her ability to find joy in simple things, her natural instinct to teach and encourage others, her absolute faith that everyone was capable of creating something beautiful. All right, he said, extending his hand toward Tavira. Let's build some bridges. As they shook hands, Drevin felt the familiar stirring of a new project beginning, the mix of excitement and apprehension that came with committing to build something he had never attempted before. But this time, instead of working alone in his workshop, he would be collaborating with someone who brought resources and vision to match his, craftsmanship and community connections. The partnership was formed, but the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks after the handshake that launched their partnership, Drevin discovered that building bridges between corporate resources and community needs was significantly more complicated than any carpentry project he had ever attempted. The initial enthusiasm that had followed Tavira's proposal had been replaced by the grinding reality of bureaucratic obstacles, political maneuvering, and increasingly sophisticated attempts to sabotage their efforts before they could gain meaningful momentum. The first warning sign had come in the form of a surprise visit from county building inspectors, who had arrived at his workshop with clipboards, measuring tapes, and a suddenly discovered concern about whether his home-based business met current zoning requirements for educational activities. The inspection had been thorough, invasive, and clearly designed to find violations rather than ensure compliance. Mr. Thorsell, the lead inspector had said with the kind of officious politeness that barely concealed hostility, we've received complaints about increased vehicle traffic, noise levels, and possible commercial activities that exceed your residential permits. Complaints were transparently fabricated. His neighbors had been nothing but supportive of the project, with several volunteering to help with construction and planning. But the inspection process would take weeks to resolve, during which time any significant development of the community workshop would be effectively frozen. The second escalation had targeted Tavira directly, but with far more subtlety than the crude intimidation tactics employed by the corporate espionage team. A series of articles had appeared in trade publications questioning her judgment, her company's financial stability, and the wisdom of pursuing vanity projects in economically marginal communities when industries faced increasing competitive pressures. The articles were too well coordinated, too strategically placed, and too specifically informed about internal company deliberations to be coincidental. Someone with significant resources and detailed knowledge of her business operations was conducting a sophisticated public relations campaign designed to undermine her credibility with investors, board members, and industry partners. It's the same pattern we saw with the espionage investigation, Tavira had explained during a tense phone call from her corporate headquarters. They can't attack the project directly without exposing themselves to legal consequences. so they're trying to make it politically impossible for me to continue. But the most disturbing escalation had come in the form of threats that crossed the line from professional harassment to personal intimidation. Drevin had arrived at his workshop Tuesday morning to find that someone had broken in during the night, not to steal anything valuable, but to leave a message. His carefully organized tools had been rearranged into a disturbing pattern on his workbench: chisels, saws, and hammers arranged to spell out words that made their meaning unmistakable: back off and last warning. The intruders had been careful not to damage anything, but they had demonstrated intimate knowledge of his workspace, his daily routines, and his most prized possessions. Most ominously, they had left one of Callis's drawings taped to his workshop wall, a picture she had made of their family that normally hung on the refrigerator inside the house. The message was clear: they could reach his daughter whenever they chose to escalate further. Drevin had called Sheriff Morrison immediately, but the law enforcement response had been frustratingly limited. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no surveillance footage, and no concrete evidence that would allow them to identify the intruders or connect them to the larger pattern of harassment. "I'll increase patrols in your area," Morrison had promised, "but without more evidence, there's not much else I can do legally. These people are professionals. They know exactly how far they can push, without crossing lines that would trigger serious criminal investigations. Crossing lines that would trigger serious criminal investigations." Sheriff's assessment had been confirmed that same afternoon when Callis's elementary school had received an anonymous call claiming that Drevin was involved in dangerous activities that might put students at risk. The call had been brief, untraceable, and carefully worded to trigger mandatory reporting procedures that would require school administrators to investigate before they could be cleared to continue normal operations. "Mr. Thorsell," Principal Watson had said during their emergency meeting, her voice heavy with regret, "I know this is completely unfounded, but we have protocols we're required to follow whenever we receive reports of potential safety issues involving students or parents. The investigation would be resolved quickly." Drevin's reputation in the community was spotless, and the claims were obviously fabricated, but the process would be humiliating, disruptive, and designed to make him question whether pursuing the partnership with Tavira was worth exposing Callis to ongoing harassment. That evening, as he sat in his kitchen reviewing the incident reports that had accumulated over the past 3 weeks, Drevin felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had defined his life since Sarah's death. Every decision he made had consequences for Callis, and the people targeting their project had clearly identified his daughter as his primary vulnerability. "Daddy, why are people being mean to us?" Callis asked from her seat at the kitchen table, where she was working on homework that involved drawing pictures of her family and writing sentences about what made each person special. The question cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that some people view kindness as weakness, that powerful individuals sometimes respond to challenges by targeting the innocent, that doing the right thing often requires accepting personal risks that extend to those you love most? "Some people get scared when they see others trying to build something good," Drevin said carefully, choosing words that would be truthful without being terrifying. "They think that if we succeed, it might make their own choices look bad by comparison." Callis considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "But we're not trying to make anyone look bad. We're just trying to help people learn things." "You're absolutely right," Drevin agreed. "But not everyone sees it that way." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Drevin's protective instincts immediately went on high alert. The knocking pattern was too confident, too demanding to be a friendly neighbor, but too official to be another intimidation attempt. Through the door's window, he could see Tommy Hendricks standing on his front porch, but his friend's usually relaxed demeanor had been replaced by obvious agitation. Drevin opened the door carefully, noting that Tommy's hands were shaking slightly and his eyes held the particular combination of anger and fear that comes from being personally threatened. from being personally threatened. "They got to me too," Tommy said without preamble. 3 men in suits showed up at the Morgan construction site this afternoon. "Started asking questions about you, about your corporate connections, about whether I thought you were still trustworthy." Tommy stepped inside, glancing around nervously as if expecting to be overheard. "They weren't directly threatening, but they made it clear that continuing to associate with you might hurt my business relationships. Several of the subcontractors I work with have gotten similar visits." The pattern was becoming clear. Rather than focusing exclusively on Drevin and Tavira, their opponents were systematically targeting everyone in their support network, using economic pressure and social isolation to make continuing the partnership prohibitively costly for everyone involved. "What did you tell them?" Drevin asked. "I told them to go to hell," Tommy replied immediately, then glanced toward the kitchen where Kellis was still working on her homework. "Sorry, kiddo. I told them to go away and not come back." "Good," Kellis called from the kitchen. "Mean people should go away." Her simple moral clarity reminded Drevin of why they were fighting this battle in the first place. The community workshop project wasn't just about economic development or corporate social responsibility. It was about demonstrating that ordinary people could still choose to build something positive despite pressure from those who profited from maintaining the status quo. Tommy's expression grew more serious. "But Drevin, you need to understand what you're up against. These aren't just random corporate security goons anymore. Whoever's coordinating this campaign has serious resources, detailed intelligence about our community, and a long-term strategy for isolating you from local support." The assessment matched Drevin's own growing understanding of the situation. The escalation pattern was too sophisticated, too well coordinated to be improvised harassment. Someone with significant experience in corporate warfare was treating their small-town partnership as a serious threat that required systematic neutralization. "Have you talked to Tavira about this?" Tommy asked. "She's dealing with her own escalation," Drevin replied. "Board meetings, investor pressure, media campaigns designed to make her look reckless or unstable. So they're attacking both ends of the partnership simultaneously," Tommy observed, "making it politically impossible for her to continue from the corporate side, while making it personally untenable for you to continue from the community side." It was a strategy that revealed both the resources and the desperation of their opponents. The community workshop project had clearly struck a nerve with powerful interests who viewed any demonstration of successful cooperation between corporate resources and local communities as a threat to their preferred model of extractive capitalism. But understanding the strategy also revealed its potential weaknesses. Campaigns this sophisticated required coordination, funding, and ongoing management, all of which created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people willing to fight back with equal determination. "Tommy," Drevin said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had emerged during the confrontation at Millbrook Cafe, "how many people do you think would be willing to stand up to these intimidation tactics if they understood what was really at stake?" His friend's eyes brightened with recognition. They had spent the past 3 weeks being reactive, responding to threats and trying to minimize damage. But maybe it was time to become proactive, to turn their community connections into active resistance rather than passive vulnerability. "Why don't we find out?" Tommy replied. The escalation was about to become a two-way street. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning during Millbrook's monthly community market, when the town square filled with families, local vendors, and the kind of neighborly connections that had made their small town worth defending. Drevin had chosen the timing deliberately. If their opponents wanted to play intimidation games, they would have to do it in front of the entire community. He stood at the makeshift information booth he and Tommy had constructed overnight, surrounded by architectural plans, financial projections, and testimonials from community members who supported the workshop project. Kelly sat at a small table beside him, offering hand-drawn information flyers to anyone who stopped to learn about their plans. The response had been overwhelmingly positive. Betty had brought coffee and pastries for everyone who volunteered to help. Dr. Hendricks had spent an hour explaining to curious neighbors how the technology training could complement traditional healthcare education. Even Pastor Williams had endorsed the project from his booth promoting the Youth Center initiative. That was when the black sedans arrived. 6 vehicles pulled into the market area with the kind of aggressive precision that made every conversation stop mid-sentence. Men in expensive suits emerged with clipboards, badges, and the officious authority of people accustomed to shutting down activities they disapproved of. The lead figure approached their booth with papers already prepared. "Mr. Thorsell, I'm Agent Crawford with the State Economic Development Authority. We have reports of unauthorized commercial activities being conducted without proper permits or environmental assessments. The timing was perfect, too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had coordinated this intervention to occur during maximum public visibility, designed to humiliate Drevin and demonstrate that community support meant nothing when faced with official authority." "What specific commercial activities?" Tommy asked, stepping up beside his friend. "Unlicensed educational services, potential violation of child safety regulations, and preliminary construction activities that exceed residential zoning allowances," Crawford replied, reading from his clipboard with practiced bureaucratic detachment. Accusations were carefully crafted to sound serious while being vague enough to avoid specific legal challenges. More importantly, they were designed to trigger lengthy investigation processes that would effectively kill the project through bureaucratic strangulation. Betty moved closer to the booth, her maternal instincts activated by the threat to someone she had claimed as family. "These men have been harassing this community for weeks," she announced loudly enough for nearby vendors to hear. "This isn't about permits or regulations. This is about powerful people trying to intimidate us into abandoning something good." Her words carried across the market square, and suddenly other community members began gathering around the booth. Dr. Hendricks brought her entire family. Pastor Williams left his youth center display to join the growing crowd. Even Mrs. Chun, despite her age, walked slowly but deliberately to stand with her neighbors. Crawford clearly hadn't expected organized community resistance. His carefully planned bureaucratic intimidation was designed to isolate Drevin and force him to fight alone against official authority. But the people of Millbrook had spent 3 weeks watching their neighbors face escalating harassment, and they had reached their own conclusions about who represented genuine community interests. "Agent Crawford," Pastor Williams said with the calm authority that made him effective at mediating disputes, "could you show us your official identification and explain exactly which agency authorized this investigation?" The question cut straight to the heart of the intimidation strategy. Crawford produced credentials that looked official but refused to allow close examination. His responses about authorization became increasingly vague when pressed for specific details. That was when Tavira arrived. She stepped out of a modest sedan, not one of the Ferraris, but a vehicle that wouldn't attract attention, accompanied by a woman in a sharp business suit who carried herself with unmistakable legal authority. "Agent Crawford," Tavira said clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent market square. "I believe you know my attorney, Sarah Martinez from the State Attorney General's office. She has some questions about the authority under which you're operating." The transformation in Crawford's demeanor was immediate and telling. The confident bureaucratic authority evaporated, replaced by the nervous uncertainty of someone who had just realized his carefully planned operation was unraveling in the most public way possible. Martinez stepped forward with documents of her own. "Mr. Crawford, we've been investigating reports of fraudulent official actions targeting this community. I'm afraid we're going to need to examine your credentials and speak with your supervisor about the legal basis for this intervention." The crowd of community members had grown to include most of the market vendors and their families. Children pressed close to their parents, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't understand the specific details. And at the center of it all, Callis stood up from her small table. "Excuse me," she said in her clear 6-year-old voice, addressing Crawford directly. "Are you here to help people or hurt people?" The question hung in the morning air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. In 6 simple words, Callis had articulated the choice that everyone present understood they were witnessing, between those who used authority to build communities and those who used it to tear them down. Crawford looked around at the faces surrounding him, community members who had chosen to stand together rather than be intimidated separately. His carefully planned operation had become a public exposure of the tactics being used against their neighbors. Within an hour, the fraudulent agents had been escorted away by actual law enforcement. The truth about the harassment campaign began spreading through social media and local news. And the community workshop project, rather than being shut down by intimidation, had gained the kind of public support that would make future interference politically impossible. The battle was won, but the victory belonged to everyone who had chosen to stand together. 5 months later, the Millbrook Community Technology Workshop buzzed with the kind of productive energy that comes from people discovering they're capable of creating things they never thought possible. The converted warehouse space hummed with the sounds of 3D printers, laser cutters, and traditional hand tools working in harmony, while laughter and conversation filled the spaces between the mechanical rhythms. Drevin stood in the main workshop area watching as Elena Rodriguez, a single mother who had been laid off from the textile factory, carefully guided a piece of reclaimed barnwood through the CNC router she had learned to program just 3 weeks earlier. She was creating custom cutting boards with intricate designs that she would sell at farmers markets throughout the region, transforming her unemployment into entrepreneurial opportunity. Got at the next station, 16-year-old Marcus Thompson worked alongside retired machinist Frank O'Brien, combining traditional metalworking techniques with computer-controlled precision to restore vintage engine parts. Their intergenerational collaboration had become one of the workshop's most successful partnerships, with a growing list of classic car enthusiasts seeking their services. Near the front of the space, Callis had established what everyone called the Ideas Corner, where she interviewed workshop participants about their projects and turned their stories into colorful illustrated books that documented the community's creative achievements. Her innocent questions often led to breakthrough insights that helped people solve problems they had been struggling with for weeks. "Daddy, look what Mrs. Patterson made," Callis announced, holding up an intricate jewelry box crafted from locally sourced maple. She said it's for keeping dreams safe until they're ready to come true. The metaphor captured everything the workshop had become, a place where people's dreams were protected and nurtured until they could manifest as tangible reality. What had started as Tavira's vision of bridging corporate resources with community needs had evolved into something far more profound, a demonstration that technology could amplify human creativity rather than replace it. The success had exceeded everyone's most optimistic projections. The pilot program had attracted attention from educational institutions, economic development agencies, and technology companies seeking authentic ways to contribute to community growth. Requests for similar workshops had come from over 40 communities across 12 states, each eager to adapt the Millbrook model to their own local needs and resources. Tavira arrived for her weekly site visit, no longer the exhausted fugitive who had stumbled into their cafe that October evening, but a leader who had discovered that corporate success meant nothing without genuine social impact. She had restructured Morwen Industries around the principle that technology companies should serve communities rather than extracting value from them, and the workshop network had become the flagship demonstration of that philosophy. "How's our pioneer doing?" she asked, joining Drevin near the community bulletin board where local success stories were posted, alongside upcoming classes and collaborative project announcements. "Still learning something new every day," Drevin replied. watching as Alina successfully completed her cutting board design and began planning her next, more ambitious project. Turns out that teaching people to combine traditional skills with modern tools doesn't just create better products, it creates more confident people. Their relationship had deepened over the months of working together, built on shared values and mutual respect, rather than dramatic rescue scenarios. Romance had emerged naturally from partnership, the kind of love that develops between people who discover they're building toward the same vision of what the world could become. Kelly's had been the first to recognize what the adults were too cautious to acknowledge. "Are you and Miss Tavira going to be a family now?" She had asked one evening, with the directness that cut through all adult complexity to reach essential truths. The question had led to conversations about building a life together, about creating a home where business success and community service weren't competing priorities, but complementary aspects of the same commitment to making the world better for the next generation. As the afternoon workshop session concluded, participants gathered in the community space for coffee and the informal sharing that had become as valuable as the technical training. Stories were exchanged, problems were solved collaboratively, and connections were made that would last long after specific projects were completed. Tommy approached with the day's statistics: enrollment numbers that continued climbing, job placement rates that exceeded state averages, and most importantly, testimonials from participants who had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. "You know what the best part is?" Tommy said, gesturing toward the diverse group of community members who were planning their next creative ventures. "Nobody calls this a corporate initiative anymore. It's just what we do here: help each other build the lives we want to live." That evening, as the workshop settled into quiet and the last participants headed home to families and dreams that had grown larger since morning, Drevin and Tavira sat with Kellis in the Ideas Corner, planning the illustrated book that would tell the story of how a simple question in a small cafe had grown into a movement that was transforming communities across the country. "What should we call it?" Kellis asked, her crayon poised over the cover page. Drevin and Tavira exchanged glances, both thinking of that October night when everything changed because a 6-year-old recognized that someone was in trouble and believed that helping was always the right response. "How about what neighbors do?" Tavira suggested. Kellis nodded approvingly and began to write, her careful letters spelling out the truth that had started everything. Neighbors help each other, communities protect their own, and sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the largest transformations. Outside, Millbrook settled into evening quiet, but the ripples continued spreading outward, carrying the message that ordinary people armed with extraordinary compassion could indeed change the world. One workshop, one partnership, one moment of courage at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.